What is corruption? Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. It hurts everyone whose life, livelihood, or happiness depends on the integrity of people in a position of authority.
Countries with low levels of corruption usually perform better on economic, human, and political indicators than countries with high levels of corruption. Although corruption affects everyone to varying degrees, it is especially an economic, social, and political tax on low-income groups in that it robs them of opportunity of a better life, better education, economic prosperity, and political freedom. The adverse impacts of corruption depend on how deeply it has poisoned different institutions of the society. High levels of corruption precipitate ethnic conflicts, civil wars, rebellions, and armed conflicts in any society. The monster of corruption increases exponentially in strength and size, so it should be detected and treated as early as possible. The burden of detection and treatment of corruption does not only fall on government, but on society as well. It requires a social and civil response of constant vigilance, monitoring, and action. We need to go to the root of the problem, causes of corruption. From the vast amount of theoretical literature available, three conditions stand out: the existence of economic rent, the presence of discretionary power, and weak institutions. Economic rent arises when a person has something unique in his possession. There is a lack of market competition, and the government often has uncontrolled monopoly power in the provision of a service. For example, a bureaucrat in charge of the business proposal approval process can engage in rent-seeking activities based on his monopoly power. Discretionary power refers to the ability to exercise personal judgment and discretion when administering a rule. The abuse of this discretionary power leads to corruption and gives bureaucrats the ability to extract economic rent. Weak institutions include political, administrative, and legal dimensions. For political institutions, the lack of transparency refers to information asymmetry in policy processes. The lack of accountability implies the absence of authority and systems to ensure that individuals are held responsible for their actions. Bureaucracy is a huge problem in weak administrative institutions. Complicated and often expensive tax and licensing systems imply that 1. Paying bribes may be cheaper than paying actual taxes, and 2. It is more efficient to pay slightly more to get from A to D instead of from A to B to C to D. Excessive regulation and complex processes also provide lots of opportunities for corrupt officials to cover up their paths. Low wages for civil servants also provides greater incentive to accept bribes and less incentive to do commensurate work based on their salary. For legal institutions, the lack of penalty and enforcement implies that people can get away easily with bribery. Therefore, there is no deterrence to corruption, and it is seen less as a crime than a norm. The combination of these three factors provide the perfect climate for corruption to rise and persist. If you have the power to make more money without being caught or penalized, then why not? Why is corruption bad then? From an economic perspective, corruption leads to the rise of an underground economy, implying that macroeconomic indicators such as GDP and inflation rates can no longer be used as reliable basis for policy making. It also leads to lower investments due to increased costs and risks for both foreign investors and local business setups. This is a major deterrent for economic growth, especially in developing countries. Power in the hands of a few also naturally leads to skewed public spending as the rich pursue their selfish interests. This often leads to many white elephant projects and reduced expenditure on education and healthcare. For example, in a corrupt village, there may be a golf course but not a school. As a result, income distribution will be widely skewed. Other economic consequences include the misallocation of resources, depletion of national wealth, and lower quality of infrastructure and public services. Just imagine a country where the poor are dying of starvation each day, and the president is building golden toilet bowls in his home. Politically, corruption reduces the fundamental role of the government, leading to mistrust and inefficiencies in the state. It distorts political development by reducing political participation and competition. It also reduces the transparency of decision-making and the legitimacy of democracy and the market economy. Corruption also undermines international aid efforts due to the division and leakage of funds. The money almost never gets to where it is intended to go. It reduces tax revenue, causes large fiscal deficits, and jeopardizes the pursuit of other national development goals. In the face of growing corruption, governments across the globe have been taking strict measures to curb corruption. While anti-corruption strategies vary across countries, most of them have some elements in common. In order to put in place a robust policy in the fight against corruption, countries have enacted specialized legislations. These laws broadly define what constitutes an act of corruption, criminalize such acts, what is prohibited and allowed, and specify penalties for violations. In addition, they impose an array of disclosure requirements upon public servants. Moreover, these laws also include additional legislations for an anti-money laundering, whistleblowers, right of information, and establishment of independent anti-corruption authorities. While such laws are essential, many governments have created independent anti-corruption authorities to enforce these laws transparently and without internal or external influence. Accordingly, such authorities are granted wide-ranging powers through specialized legislations for enforcement, which include powers to investigate, assess financial information, arrest or detain, seize documents, extradite, prosecute, etc., without considering the social, economic, and political standing of perpetrators. Some countries have increased the scope of work of such authorities to also include preemptive strategies such as assessment of vulnerabilities and review of procedures in organizations, public awareness activities, and the like. Moreover, countries rely on independent judicial systems with competent and sufficiently paid judges to punish corrupt practices under the law. Some countries, such as Indonesia and Pakistan, have also established specialized anti-corruption courts for adjudication of cases under the anti-corruption laws. Political parties are also regulated under the regime with specific focus on their finances and creation of rules on lobbying of politicians by interest groups. In order to further curtail corruption, some countries such as Singapore and Hong Kong have adopted the principles of meritocracy in the civil service with a high reward system for performance. Additionally, various countries have introduced transparency measures such as financial audit of government, public bidding of government contracts, electronic government policies, freedom of media, and the like to allow public scrutiny. The private sector and civil society also have an instrumental role in fighting corruption. In most cases, it is with them rather than the government that the impetus lies, as corruption is most detrimental to people outside government. Businesses and organizations have come up with many innovative and effective ways to expose and pressurize governments to clean up their act. These methods can largely be classified into evolutionary and revolutionary methods. Evolutionary methods involve the government in question and aim to negotiate and persuade a course of action. This is effective in that it is able to access sensitive information and rally the support of enforcement institutions, which is often controlled by the government. An example of negotiations to stem out corruption is the UN Convention Against Corruption, which pressurized governments to criminalize acts of corruption, help one another in cross-border investigations, and restore national assets. The limitation of closed-door negotiations is that many who are victims of corruption, the poor laborer or child with no access to health and education, have no voice, and hence there is a lack of urgency and immediacy. Anti-corruption interest groups should augment the effectiveness of negotiations by publishing findings that are illuminating, thus further pressurizing governments to act. A good example of such a publication is Transparency International's Defense Companies Anti-Corruption Index, which through its publication invites people to question the validity and scale of defense spending, which is a sensitive and secretive area in many countries. When controversial and sensitive information is published, the larger community may then react, sometimes in a revolutionary way. Media publicity and social movements have led to some significant upheavals, Watergate being a case in point and WikiLeaks being a more contemporary example. The first step of fighting corruption is exposure and denouncement. Businesses and organizations make frequent use of media campaigns as they are sensory, shocking, and hence a powerful call to action. They also incite social movements that invite wider participation and solidarity among citizens and voters. Uganda's Black Monday campaign is a good example in spreading awareness of corruption in Uganda and getting domestic and international attention to pressurize the Ugandan leadership to act swiftly and effectively. Whether evolutionary or revolutionary, the larger society outside of governments must make their voices heard so that corruption is exposed and dealt with in the public sphere. Myanmar suffers from endemic corruption and ranks as the third most corrupt country in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Corruption paralyzes the country's economic and social development. Myanmar's lucrative natural resources such as oil, gas, and gemstones are controlled by former military regime insiders, and wealth does not get redistributed to the poor majority. Cronyism and nepotism is pervasive across industries, and the lack of opportunity for the masses keeps them in the cycle of poverty. In addition, corrupt government officials often siphon foreign investments and aid meant to uplift the population. To combat corruption in Myanmar, anti-corruption laws must be written, enacted, and enforced swiftly. In the longer term, a review of public servant salaries should be undertaken to provide an incentive for honest work. Myanmar should engage international expertise in strengthening institutions that provide an important check on government authority, such as an independent judiciary and a robust media. Corruption's causes are varied and its consequences are dire. To fight it, a multi-level approach involving government, businesses, and civil society is necessary. In today's world of growing economic disparities, heightened political awareness, and military might, fighting corruption is urgent. With new technologies, creative ideas, and brave spirits, the global community can defeat corruption.